With this interesting introduction, I invite the first speaker, Mr. Vaitheeshwaran. He is a practicing advocate with a standing of about close to 3 decades, and he advises for corporates, various corporates and various associations. And he is both ICWA and also a CS. And he is also author of various books on indirect taxes and SENVAT and VAT. He is also head of the Taxation Committee of Madras Chamber of Commerce and Industry, member of Tamil Nadu Branch Committee, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, member of Economic Policy Advisory Committee, and Confederation of Indian Industry Southern Region. Now I request Mr. Vaitheeshwaran to share his viewpoints on this topic.
Our constitution focuses significantly on fundamental rights, but doesn't talk much about fundamental duties. And most of you do agree that today the polity and the citizens always talk about rights. At all points of time, they talk about their rights. But what about duties to yourself, to the society? Nothing is there. So maybe one of the topics that could dominate the discussions in the future could be a chapter on fundamental duties. I just picked off from MRV. Sorry, that was not my topic at all. But that's what happens in sessions like this. So when I was called to share some of my thoughts, I kind of went back to my school days and then looked at some of the literature that is floating around in discussions. And today there is a current feeling as to what is the nature of our constitution. Some call it federal, some call it quasi-federal, some call it partly federal, and some call it that it is only federal on paper, but the states' rights have been trampled over and continuously being trampled over. This seems to be, the vein that you get in some of the literature that you read or the print media that you read. But if you look at what really is the federal, it would mean a political society in which several states form a unit but remain independent in internal affairs. Now, all of them refer to the American Constitution. They say American Constitution is a classic example of a federal constitution. There was a need to create a federal constitution at that point of time because all of them were fighting with each other and they had to get together. So states agreed to come together and create a country, and because of that they said, okay, states would have more rights than the center. And that's how the American Constitution is structured. But over a period of time, if you notice, things have completely changed. The so-called federal US Constitution has changed significantly over a period of time without much of amendments, through interpretation, through policy decisions, in such a manner that the federal has got significant powers over the state. I'll give you a classic example as to what happened. You had this scenario where the war happened. The depression happened. When the depression happened, the federal government felt that there must be compensation to the public. There must be unemployment compensation to the public. This is completely against your capitalistic policy and laissez-faire policy. So when the the federal government had to look at this kind of a solution, they came with a marvelous idea of putting a 90% payroll tax at the federal level. And then said that the states will have to match this, and whichever state, gives certain kind of relief will get more grants from the federal. The effect of that is slowly that the economic pressure was applied by the federal on the states, and the compensation started rolling out from the states also. So what this conveys is that even though you call it as a federal constitution, at various points of time, things have slowly changed. Whereas in contrast, Canada is very different. Canada, what happens is that you have this feeling that the focus towards the center must be significant initially. But then the Privy Council completely changed it. Over a period of time, the states got little more rights in terms of interpretation thanks to Quebec. And there the problem was the language. One part of Canada wanted the English or the British thought process. The other part was the French process. So the Quebec was a French constituency. So that created a completely different kind of a situation as far as Canada is concerned. Australia, initially the center's powers were limited, completely limited. But then over a period of time, it moved to centralization. And I'm surprised by the fact that all these countries use tax as a weapon whenever it's required. So in Canada, in Australia, what happened? The war was significant. And war created so much of pressure that the federal was worried about the resources that is required. And therefore, they requested the states to vacate the space of income tax. Because the federal and the states levied income tax. So they requested the states to vacate. The states refused. So at that point of time, the federal passed various laws increasing high rates of income tax and also changed the laws to say that the federal tax recovery will be prior to the state tax recovery, and then pulled out all the state income tax staff for the federal collection in such a manner that the state said, okay, we'll leave this subject in. So look at all these ways things are done. These are not really constitutional amendments. If you look at the US, there are only about 27 constitutional amendments. But if you look at India's constitution, at every stage, if something is required, we have gone through the process. In fact, I keep getting this thought process. 2 days back, somebody was talking about saying that education should move back from the concurrent list to the state list. Now, how did it go to the concurrent list? It went through the 42nd constitutional amendment. And when you amend the constitution, specifically remove an item from one list to another list, our constitution has got adequate safeguards. Currently, Article 368(2) is quite clear that if you're touching any of the entries in the list, not only should the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha clear it with 3/4 majority, that legislation must be adopted by more than 50% of the state legislatures. The act has to be adopted in respect to legislatures. So after all this only, education, forests and other items moved from the state list to the concurrent list. Therefore, it's very funny to say that education has to come back to the state list and so on and so forth. Those kind of debates are going on in the market. Now, I would put it this way. Our constitution appears to be federal, but is largely centric and probably should be more centric. And why is that? Things have changed now. World over, the Ukraine war has taught us different lessons now. Every country is saying nation first. Globalization has changed something else to something else now. My country first, my polity first, my energy crisis first, my people first. So if you're looking at your persons first, you obviously need a federal or a centric character rather than a complete division saying that. Most of the policy decisions concerning with international affairs will have to come from the center. And therefore, our constitution is centric and probably will have to become more centric as we think forward in terms of reform. Now, the second topic which I'm going to talk about is with reference to, again, taxation, the 7th schedule of our constitution. Now, all of us, he was referring to various countries which were borrowed and all that. Fundamentally, if you look at, the constitution was built on Government of India Act 1935. Government of India Act, if you read carefully, and if you look at the story behind the Government of India Act, it is based on a joint committee report on Indian constitutional reform in UK in 1934. Based on that report, the discussions happened saying that this will be, provincial, this would be the federal or the dominion, and that's how the subjects will be decided. So that's how the lists were born. So when we look at our constitution and look at these lists, you'll be surprised, except for tax on electricity, everything else is the same. Probably because electricity was born at that point of time. Power generation happened, and therefore they decided to tax electricity also. So you fundamentally borrow from the Government of India Act, significantly all those entries, and then those entries form part of the 7th schedule. And we still have these debates as to what is happening in this entry, whether state entry or center entry, etc. In fact, when I talk to most of the people on GST, I keep telling them that GST is a reform. And everybody, most of you in the public would understand that before GST, what was there? We had 13 taxes. We had 13 indirect taxes. We had complex tax structures. We had cascading effect of tax. We had price on tax. Nearly 34% of indirect taxes existed. So GST was a super reform. Now, interestingly, why did GST even come? Yes, it is a reform. It's like this, philosophically they'll say that if you want to clear the water, you must first stir the water and make it as dirty as possible, and then it will slowly settle down. Like that, the entries in the constitution were fairly structured. Union list, state list, concurrent list. But the interpretation of these entries resulted in what we know as the complex cascading effect of taxes. So what we call as overlapping of taxes. Most of them are judge-made laws. It is not because of the entries that those overlapping happened. Most of them flowed from decisions. Now, interestingly, Madras has got its rightful place in all these matters from beginning. So when Government of India Act 1935 came, we had the provinces and the dominion. And we had what is called as the Madras Sales Tax Act 1939, which said that if there is a sale, there can be a sales tax. This matter went up to federal court, where the fundamental point was, look, as per the dominion list, if I manufacture, I have to pay excise duty. I am manufacturing the same commodity, I'm paying excise duty. Why should I pay sales tax? Matter went to federal court, and even in those days, it was interpreted saying that is a different entry, there is a different entry. That is also fine, this is also fine. In fact, they gave it beautifully. It is natural that there are two complementary powers, each expressed in precise and definite terms. There can be no reasons for giving a broader interpretation to one power rather than the other. Both taxes can continue to exist. So if you look at overlapping of taxes, overlapping started from the famous Buddu Podanna case of the first STC, which was reported in the federal court. Now, just like how Madras did it, Berar province decided to put sales tax on motor spirit. This was challenged, saying that, look, you cannot levy motor spirit sales tax because there is already excise duty on it. Again, court came to the rescue and said that nothing wrong. Both entries can be read harmoniously together. You can levy excise duty. You can also levy this. And that gave this theory of widest interpretation of entries. The entry must be widely interpreted. Incidental ancillary powers in that entry can also be read into. And then over a period of time, one more doctrine. Of course, we as MRV was talking about borrowing from English and Ireland and French, we also borrow a lot of juristic principles and interpretation. We borrowed what is called as doctrine of pith and substance. The substance of the pith. So doctrine of pith and substance is such that the doctrine would be looked at in such a manner that look at the enactment as a whole. Look at the object of the enactment. Look at the scope and effect of the provisions. And then see if you can fit into it. So based on pith and substance, you had various judgments which came in interpreting state versus center entries. And slowly, the state levies were upheld. Central levies were also upheld in certain cases, but state levies significantly, or state legislations, were also upheld by the courts by applying this doctrine of pith and substance. And then came the beautiful next doctrine. Again, we borrowed from Canadian Supreme Court. We borrowed what is called as aspect. This aspect is different. So if you take this microphone, there is a manufacturing activity. Manufacturing aspect can be taxed by excise duty. Then you sell it. Okay, there is a selling aspect. Selling aspect can be subject to sales tax. Then this microphone enters from this state to another state, and that state said, I have the power to levy entry tax. But this fellow said, look, I've already paid sales tax, it's just a destination, it's only reaching there. Doesn't matter, it is entering. Therefore, entry aspect attracts entry tax. And then the microphone has to be repaired. The service aspect attracts service tax. So what really happened over a period of time is the aspect theory resulted in multiple taxes, multiple levies. And after a point of time, people said this is just too much for a transaction. And that is how GST as a thought process was born. So if you look at the significant 101st Amendment of the Constitution, which brought in GST through various articles, including 246A, the thought process was, look, all these are ultimately the same transactions. And one new word was defined, which ultimately addresses everything, supply. So whether it is manufacture, whether it is sale, whether it is service or entry, it is ultimately supply. So now today, one supply is taxed. And I'm sometimes, being the profession, it is very funny to read in the newspapers as well as, when you get caught in some of these TV channel interviews, they get very upset by the GST by saying that center is imposing too much of GST on this transaction. There is no center GST. There is a center and a state GST on the same transaction. So if there is 18% GST, center levies 9%, state levies 9%. And both of them sit together and decide to put this. That's the best part of it. The GST Council, if you look at the minutes, today we have the 48th GST Council meeting minutes. If you look at the 48th GST Council meeting discussions, everything is unanimous. So whether it is branded paneer or otherwise, the tax decision is taken there. And if you look at the minutes, nobody objects to it. No state objects to it. You may say that I don't have a significant vote to decide against this, but you can record your objection. All states are absolutely happy in increasing rates of tax because it also comes to them, 50% comes to them. So every state in a way is happy about the fact that the GST is contributing significantly, and therefore 246A by itself is its own solution to what was a problem created through various interpretations, which was natural because the law was like that. It had to be interpreted, and we had brilliant lawyers who could interpret this. So when we had lawyers putting forth this argument, the courts will naturally accept that, and then judge-made law slowly became, and once it's a precedent, that will be applied to other things. So you had expenditure taxes, you had service taxes, you had different kinds of taxes which came into the picture. Now this 46th Amendment, 101st Amendment to the Constitution, what has actually done? My view is that this would be a trend setter. This would probably change many things in the future. maybe river water disputes, maybe land area disputes, and probably even revenue as a big item between state and center could get solved through this kind of solution. Because now we are looking at what is called as pooled sovereignty. What is the 101st Amendment is nothing but a pooled sovereignty where you bring in cooperative federalism. So decision making is almost identical at the same point of time, and therefore the interests are equally met. This can really change things. And one more thing which keeps going, 2 days back there was an article saying we should tax agricultural income. Agricultural income is a state subject. But states don't levy income tax on agricultural income. They did levy, about 6 states, Bihar, Assam, Tamil Nadu, they levied agricultural income tax, but it was on plantation crops, like tea, coffee, rubber, etc. And most of them have repealed their legislations. But the entry exists. The power to levy tax on agriculture lies with the state, not with the center. But will the states exercise their power and levy tax on agricultural income? Obviously, the answer is no, because it would not be a very, very good idea politically. And this is not what I am saying. This was said so in 1925 itself, where the tax report said, there is no justification for continuing the exemption for agricultural income tax, though politically it may be right. 1925. And after nearly 100 years, we're still talking about the same subject as to whether there can be a right to tax the agricultural income. Of course, we're not talking about the small farmers getting taxed. We're talking about large players in the businesses, etc., who can look at it. So probably, I'm sticking out my neck here, I'm predicting by saying that just like the 101st Amendment, we may probably have in a decade another amendment which will enable a joint levy of income tax by the center and the state. And that would probably address number of issues of revenue in terms of both of them, and that can probably be the future. With that, I will conclude, and thank you for a very patient hearing.
I request Mr. Shyam Sundar to hand over the memento to the speaker.